2023. What a year for movies, and I saw a good portion of them. Today we will be counting down the worst of the worst. Which movies stink so bad they singed my eyebrows? And what's the one movie that should be burned with fire, buried, and never spoken of again? Let's find out.
My baby likes.
Hello, my beautiful butter babies. As the holidays are coming to a close, I hope you all got and gave only the good stuff this holiday season. Happy 2024! As I said in my previous video, counting down the 10 best movies of 2023, I've actually liked most of the movies I saw last year. Most of the movies were at worst mid, meaning they weren't horrible, but they weren't the best use of film either. There have been blessed few movies that took a shit on the viewing audience last year, which made this actually a really hard list to come up with. I had to dig back through all of the movies I reviewed over the last year to find 10 horrible movies, because unlike the top 10 list of best movies of this year, 10 horrible movies didn't come immediately to mind. Now, I do have a caveat to that statement. As I said in my top 10 best movies list, this list is comprised of the movies I actually saw last year. A lot of the movies that came and went without much fanfare at the theater never graced my eyes. And if it was a horror movie, well, girl, you already know. So, there may have been a movie or two or three I didn't see this year that left piles of shit everywhere in the theater. But because I never saw them, and I never will, I can't speak on them. Finally, let's talk about superhero movies. There were 10 comic book movies released last year, and I can see some of you already saying, well, there's your list right there, Stephen. Yes, but let me defend comic book movies just a tad bit. I happen to think not all the comic book movies that came out last year were terrible. In fact, out of the 10 movies released, 4 of them were phenomenal. 2 were debatably mid, and 4 were burned them with fire horrible. You know, I'm probably going to do a video saying goodbye to the DCEU, and in that video, I'm probably going to depth about the superhero genre and what went so horribly wrong with the DCEU. But as a lifelong fan of capes, I really do love the genre, and I want it to succeed. It's just really sad that 2023 was not the year for superhero movies. Alright everyone, with all that said, let's get into this list, shall we? Coming in at number 10, the best of the worst, Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. This is a perfect example of a mid-movie making the list. It's not that it's a really horrible film. It's not. But at the same time, it's not a good movie. And that's a shame because it really had all the makings of a really good movie. The cast was stacked. You had Chris Pine, Hugh Grant, Michelle Rodriguez, Reggie John Page, who should really be trying to get back on Bridgerton right about now, and Justice Smith, who should really be firing his entire team for getting him into that shitstorm that is the American Society for Magical Negroes. It was directed by the dynamic duo of Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daley, so it had everything it needed to be an amazing first entry to a new film franchise. Instead, it turned into a generic sword and sandals movie that was really forgettable. What were we talking about? Number 9, Haunted Mansion. The premise of this movie just didn't make any sense for black folk sensibilities. It just doesn't. And while it was clearly explained by the black characters of this movie had no choice but to stick around a haunted house, that in the end, as the end credits were rolling, they actually chose to stay when they could have easily left makes zero sense. At least for black people. Now, I gave this movie a hell of a lot of shit when it came out, but you know what, Better Babies? Its utter ridiculousness has melted my heart just a little bit. Nowadays, I have a soft spot for this silly movie. I won't go seeking it out, but if it popped up on my Disney Plus feed this Halloween season, I might just click play. A movie I won't be clicking play on is my number 8 pick, Transformers: Rise of the Beasts. This movie suffers because it prioritizes set pieces and things that go boom over a compelling story. Now, to be fair, this movie did have compelling characters and enough Easter eggs to keep you awake between set pieces. But Easter eggs and compelling characters with absolutely zero to actually do are not enough to make a good movie. Transformers: Rise of the Beasts plays like the worst Saturday morning cartoon you've ever seen. There's no depth to it at all. And I've said before, not every movie needs to be Oscar bait. See Fast X, which made my top 10 best movies list. Shut up. But unlike Fast X, this movie has absolutely no self-awareness about its shallowness, and it isn't laughing along with the audience. Horrible movie. Sliding into the number 7 spot, we have Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. As I said earlier, there were 10 superhero movies to choose from this year, and half of them were mid to horrible. But this movie right here, this movie right here takes the cake as the worst out of all of them. It is proof positive you shouldn't shoot your movie, 98% of it, or at least in the volume, or on the back ass of some cheap ass green screen. It just doesn't work. Marvel has chosen to go the light and jokey route on all of its movies. So much so that they're starting to all play like Saturday morning cartoons, which actually is an insult to Saturday morning cartoons because a lot of them were a lot deeper than this movie was. So, even when the stakes were high, there was Paul Rudd right there in the middle of it with the yucks. It completely undermines any gravitas this movie might have had. Then there are the nightmare-inducing characters like MODOK, whose only purpose in the film is to again bring unnecessary comedy relief. Cassie Lane is generic and underutilized, as is Hope Van Dyne, and where the heck is Luis? If they absolutely had to insert comedy into this movie, Michael Pena was all they needed. Instead, we got a nonsensical cameo from Bill Murray. Bill Murray! Its only saving grace are Michelle Pfeiffer and Jonathan Majors, who bring their A acting game as they always do. But meanwhile, rest in peace, Kang. This movie is not worth the time wasted talking about it. So you know what, Butter Babies? Let's just move on. Coming in at number 6, 65. You know what? I don't even know what to say about this movie. You know what? Actually I do. Adam Driver deserves better. There. The set pieces were great in this movie, but there was no story to anchor them. And without a good story, at best you have are good set pieces floating out there in the ether. Actually, I take that back. There was a good story in this film. It just wasn't fleshed out. This movie plays like a rough first draft of a movie committed to film. Had they given this movie more time to properly play out, instead of racing to the finish line, it was only 93 minutes long, including the credits. It could have possibly been a good movie. As it stands now, it's a stinker. All right, here we are at the top 5 worst movies of 2023. Let's get into it. Coming in at number 5, Hypnotic. Like 65, this is a movie that could have been so much better than what we got. The premise in this movie is strong. Ben Affleck plays a detective whose daughter was abducted 3 years prior. He gets a tip that his daughter may still be alive, and that sets him on his journey where what's real and what's not is really difficult to grasp. The movie is really trippy and mind-bending, and you're right along with Ben as he tries to keep his wits about him as reality changes all around him. Again, a really strong premise. Unfortunately, the execution plays out like a bargain basement inception. And that's so sad. Ben Affleck remains a solid actor and my favorite Batman of all time. Rest in peace, DCEU. And Robert Rodriguez is in my trinity of top American filmmakers of my generation. But Ben looks like he's sleepwalking through this movie, and Robert Rodriguez seems to be missing from the film altogether. He co-wrote the script, so you would think he'd be invested in how the movie turned out. It didn't play out that way. This movie could have been so much more than what it turned out to be. As I said in my initial review, it had all the makings of a really good TV series a la Alias. Instead, what we got was an outline of a movie committed to film. Number 4, No Hard Feelings. As I said in my initial review of this film, outside of the main male character in the film, there are no good people in this movie. And maybe that was the thing that drew Jennifer Lawrence to this movie in the first place. The chance to play an awful person who is absolutely irredeemable throughout most of this movie. That might have been a good enough reason for her, but that she and the main male character's parents shit all over this kid for most of the movie, and her redemption doesn't come from any other place than trying to force forgiveness out of the person she shit all over for most of the movie because she finally found a shred of her humanity is just disgusting to me. Same way with his parents. Well-meaning rich right parents that end up fucking over their kids in the worst possible ways imaginable seems to be a movie trope nowadays. That there are absolutely no consequences for anybody's bad behavior in this movie actually seems on point for the world we've created nowadays. But that this kid is expected to outright forgive them, not because he sees the compassion and humanity in forgiveness, but because one of them backs him into a corner and the other two are his parents, is just vomit-inducing. I hated this movie. Taking the bronze shit medal at number 3, we have Jesus Revolution. As I said in my initial review of this film, it's not that the movie itself is bad. It's on the very low end of mid, and it flirts around with being downright horrible at times. The reason this movie is taking the number 3 spot is because of what it had to say and not say about queer people and spirituality. One of the main characters in the film was, in real life, an out and proud gay person who ended up dying of complications of AIDS in the early 90s. And yet, that very real and integral part of who he was completely ignored and whitewashed from this movie. While in real life, it's true, Lonnie Frisbee, the man that we're talking about right now, was married very briefly to a woman. To have this story tell it, that was his sexuality in its completeness. Lonnie Frisbee's role in the Jesus Revolution amongst hippies and young people in the late 60s and early 70s cannot be denied. He was a major player in that movement, and everybody knew he was gay because he didn't go hiding it. But this movie makes zero mention of it. It's another example of queer people once again being erased from the religion and spirituality conversation. Terrible movie. Speaking of horrible movies that have to do with spirituality, here we are at the number 2 spot, which is taken by none other than Knock at the Cabin. This next part is directly taken from the in-depth review of this movie I did back when it came out earlier last year. And I quote, "As part of my spiritual consciousness is standing in the faith that ultimately the universe is kind. Our higher power, however we choose to see him, her, it, them, the unknowable, loves us unconditionally. Moreover, they are intimately concerned with and would love to be intimately involved in our day-to-day personal spiritual evolution and growth. They want to see us thrive. They want to see us succeed. They only want the best for us, and they will do everything in their power, short of denying us free will, to make that happen for us. In short, the universe loves us. There is nothing loving about the universe in this movie, however. In fact, the movie goes out of its way to drive home the fact that the universe hates us, and it wants to punish us for no other reason than it can. There are no lessons to be learned, there is no growth, there is no evolution, there is no kindness, compassion, or love. The universe in this movie is vicious and cold and cruel. It's consciously and aggressively evil. The higher power I believe in and have a personal relationship with is just not that kind of entity. And that it is suggested somewhere there could be a higher power that is exactly like the one depicted in this movie really makes me sick to my stomach." End quote. Enough said. And now, butter babies, here we are at the top of the landfill, at the top of the garbage freighter, at the tippy-tip top of the pile of shit that has been this top 10 list. Ladies and gentlemen, and all precious souls in between, this is my number 1 pick of the worst of 2023. The absolute worst movie of 2023 is House Party. Yeah. But you knew that already. But let me tell you something. 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 I went back and forth several times between this movie and Knock at the Cabin, only because objectively, House Party is a terrible movie. But Knock at the Cabin makes me want to retch. But because Knock at the Cabin is a good movie from all the technical standpoints, and House Party is not, in the end, House Party edged Cabin out for the #1 spot. There is absolutely nothing good about this movie. It's not funny at all. The premise is downright ridiculous. The third act is straight up bonkers and not in the good way. Even the Black Hollywood royalty cameos sprinkled throughout this film, including a completely nonsensical one by the original House Party crew, Kid and Play themselves, absolutely cannot save this movie. It was supposed to be a direct-to-max feature, but Zaslav needed to try and squeeze a few pennies out of a theatrical release, so here we are. Do yourself a favor, please, and watch the original House Party trilogy and skip this atrocity. You'll thank me for it. And that's it, Butter Babies. The cream of the crap crop. The top 10 worst movies of 2023. So, did your movie pick make the list? Were there movies that were left out that should have been put in? Were some of my picks off the mark? I want to hear all about it. Let me know in the comment section down below. Thank you so very much for watching, Butter Babies. Thank you so much for commenting, and of course, as always, thank you so very much for subscribing. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.